Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I promise you this is not an advertisement. This is just a regular session. So I want to introduce two of my colleagues who are going to join me today. We're going to have a conversation around emerging technology and how to think about it, how to manage it, what are the risks, what are the benefits. And to that, I've brought two esteemed colleagues of mine. If I haven't invited you, it doesn't mean I don't think you're esteemed. But I really respect everyone's opinion in the room, but I really respect Carolyn's experience and David. So David Nunes from MIT Museum, I'm sure you all know him, and he's new on the board. Carolyn Royston, Chief Experience Officer at Cooper Hewitt. We were going to have Jane Alexander, and unfortunately she had an event last night, and I think she's en route from Cleveland now, but she's not yet here to my knowledge. And so it's going to be the three of us, and we decided we're going to stand up because we were going to sit down and have a very casual chat. But I think I'm a bit worried that people won't actually be able to see us.
And this way we can break into song when it's time for that part of
we can do a salsa dance.
When the wedding bit starts.
So the reason I wanted to have this conversation, for those of you who know me, for those of you who don't know me, I spent 7 years at the Museum of Natural History in New York. Matt Tarr worked for me, Ariana French worked for me. I've worked with a bunch of you across all of the museum conferences. I now have crossed to the other side, and I now work for Microsoft, which I think surprised me and a lot of other people. And but my goal at Microsoft, I'm responsible for libraries and museums globally, and the role is like, what are the needs of museums? I'll skip the libraries for right now. What are the needs of museums globally with respect to technology? I have a long tech career. I forayed into museums about 7 years ago, so I don't have as much experience as many of you, but I think 7 years is a good inning in digital to give me a feel for what the issues are, and of course I've been on the conference circuit with all of you for a number of years now. So with that, I'd love to start a conversation around emerging technology, and I'll tell you my theory. My theory is that the phone is ringing at the front. My theory is we're very creative. Thank you. We're very creative institutions, and with that, we tend to gravitate, rightfully so, to whatever is the latest, greatest technology. And I think there's two potential challenges with that. One is that we're going to talk about, which is new technologies, very new technologies, are both immature and expensive. Immature means you're not really getting a great experience, and I'll tell you why. And expensive, we all know the answer to that question. We all have limited resources. How do we make the best use of the resources available to us? And I think that's one challenge. I think the other challenge is technology is not just visible technology. It doesn't just have to be the technology that you can see in the gallery. I feel strongly, and I will not bore you with this, technology has to permeate every level of the organization. It's about driving efficiencies in the organization. It's about driving reach and mission. And it's about doing all of these things, not just what we do in the creative aspects of gallery experiences. So with that, let me stop talking and start to involve Carolyn and David, who are looking awkward here. I wanted to start with, like, when you are thinking about technology for your museums, how do you think about it in terms of, like, if you're going to evaluate, let's just say my favorite topic, which I know I will be challenged on, I'm not a big fan of virtual reality. Microsoft is not a big fan of virtual reality. Let me tell you why. Microsoft thinks that it's a manufacturing experience at the moment. They don't feel that it's a consumer experience. That it's not yet there. But when you're looking at a new technology that's either being asked by a funder, your executive, et cetera, how do you best advise them in thinking about that? So let's just say AI, VR, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think generally museums don't ask why enough. Mm-hmm. Like, why are we investing in this technology? Why are we spending the time and resources on these? I mean, we might be asking that question in this room because we're sort of clued into that, but we aren't having that conversation, I think, where we say things like, you know what, maybe augmented reality in 2019 is not the best use of our time because we haven't defined why we are putting that in space. We haven't delivered the right use cases. And I think that's the people in this room who are digitally savvy, who are experiencing this stuff by making things, we're really the right people to be doing that. So when this happens all the time, right? Somebody knocks on my door, hey David, I just went to a museum in Europe and saw a beautiful augmented reality experience in the gallery. And we should do something with this. We should do something with augmented reality. Why? Why do we need to do that with augmented reality? Well, maybe because our visitors are expecting this. Are they? We're not asking these questions in those sorts of ways. I would contend that actually this conversation has never happened in the history of the universe. What are we going to do this weekend? Let's go to the MIT Museum. Okay, I'll go check out the website. Oh, there's not an augmented reality app for that website, for that museum. Oh, how am I going to find the objects in the space? Ask somebody. How am I going to learn more about that object when I point my phone at it? I don't know, Google or Bing.
That's fine.
So I say this, I'm not trying to be...
It's all about being.
Not trying to be disrespectful to the amazing colleagues in this room who are currently working on these things. In fact, I will flip this and say, it is incumbent on all of us to be working on augmented reality apps in November of 2019. We are living in a world of abundance of information. Right now, we could, all of us, pull out our phone, which is, by the way, an amazing miracle in its own, but all of us could pull out a phone right now, do a Google search, tutorial augmented reality app, and within a couple hours, just by following the steps, you will already learn more than by engaging in a year-long process and a $500,000 project. We can do that. It's likely that the people that are coming to this conference, rather than being out there by the pool, it's likely that you are one of the most digitally savvy people at your museum. And so the only way that you can represent what this conversation is to other folks at your museums is by making things. And making things together, sharing them, talking about them, coming to this conference, doing panels, making things. Get your hands dirty. What I would do for my director, who would not consider himself a digitally savvy person, is I would pull him to my desk. Here is an augmented reality app that either I made or I downloaded, or maybe one of you all made. What do you think about it, really?
Yeah. What do you think, Carolyn?
What do I think? I mean, I totally agree with you, David, in terms of demonstrating a use case for this. Like, where is that question being asked? And I also think, for me, a bit like you, Catherine, the necessity of having a really solid foundation and infrastructure and investment in those areas is absolutely key to anything else that's going to bring success down the line. But also understanding about the operational and financial sustainability questions around doing any of these things. Now, I'm quite fortunate that I work in a design museum, and we want to encourage prototyping. We want to talk about the process of design. We want to talk about the challenges. And so our approach to emerging technologies is to kind of think about it as an R&D space, as something separate, perhaps outside of our core offer, and then think about how we bring that into and embed it across the museum if we see that there's a use case, if we see that it's successful, and that visitors are enjoying it, and also if we can see that it's operationally sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. I think this sustainable technology is something that, that I'm very passionate about, and I've been talking a lot about this year, is this idea of like, any technology, when you look at it in a 2-year period, if you're creating it, particularly when we're dealing with emerging technologies, that 2-year period is fine and it's great for the launch and everything, but it's almost guaranteed to die. And the reason it's guaranteed to die is because, I don't hate to be so negative after Matt's lovely comments about Tonya. I felt like I needed to become a more positive person. But anyway, the reason it goes to die is because we're not treating it as a sustainable platform in the same way that we treat any other way of running the museum. There's no way that we would build a building and then never maintain it. Well, maybe we would, but generally speaking, we would never not maintain it, right? The same with your car. And the question is, why is it that sometimes we don't treat technology the same way and we treat it as a project? I don't know if you guys have views on that.
I've started including a key performance indicator on the projects that we're doing. Basically, how many core nuggets of the digital projects we're doing will survive until the next one.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit about like just acquiescing to the fact that the things that we're building are ephemeral. They're things that we build will disappear. They'll not be maintained. That's how it is. So if that's the case,
Should it be that way? Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I think if that is the case, then can we identify the core nuggets of those things that we can pull out all over? What is the survivability of the core nuggets? And those are infrastructure pieces. And I'm leaning in right now very heavily as we are getting this opportunity to rebuild our museum into a brand new location, to think heavily about what core pieces do we need right now that are going to support all the amazing things that are coming down the pipe. And they're boring, and our director doesn't care about those things, but they're important.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. And I think in so many cases, we're not really talking about technology here. We're talking about organizational change and organizational understanding, and that the responsibility for these things isn't down to one person. It's actually a whole museum. It's part of a whole museum experience. And so my feeling is always to try to think, how do we embed this? How do we really integrate this into people's work in a way that's meaningful? And how do we also look at how we evaluate it? So what are the questions? What is the criteria for success for this? And then to be evaluating and to be user testing and to be really measuring against those things before we make a big commitment into something that, may be ultimately very disappointing.
Yeah, right.
Expensive.
So one of the reasons why I discourage emerging very new technology, and when I say very new technology, I mean virtual reality. Augmented reality has actually become a little bit more sophisticated. But even, let's just go back 3 years, augmented reality 3 years ago. When I was in New York, we actually, as part of our project, had to invent augmented reality before it was actually available. And I knew that the time would come, and that was because of a funding grant and some certain expectations that came with that. But I always think we should not be in the business of inventing technology, right? There are, something that Tonya was talking about this morning, notwithstanding the fact that I do work for a tech partner these days, but even when I wasn't, this idea of the big tech companies should be inventing this technology, or it already exists in another industry, how can we leverage it? But I look at something like virtual reality, and and I made these comments a few years ago. The virtual reality experience is pixelated. It's getting better every year, but it's pixelated, and the reason why there is something that is on your head, which has become increasingly lighter, but started off being a very, very awkward experience, is because you need a lot of compute power in that device, right? But compute power, with Moore's law, gets better and better over time. And, and I think we'll find over time we're going to get higher resolution, multi-sensory, collaborative. We're already starting to see that. And then that's a good time. When that technology is mature, that's a good time, and it's also significantly cheaper. So when we're actually in organizations where we have limited resources, I wonder why we spend so much money on those kinds of things and not on maybe a more balanced approach on foundational. So
I think the other part of this as well is we haven't figured out the visitor experience around this.
Exactly.
It's going back to this idea of, is it operationally sustainable? Right now it's a very singular, isolated experience, which doesn't work well in a museum unless you actually construct an experience to support that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the other part of it, and which is why, again, we can't separate the technology from the experience.
I would say again that I do think it is critically important, even though we're 3 years out from VR and AR, at least I still think it is critically important, and I would support and I would fight to the death to support people that are working on projects here now on these things. I think the only caveat is they have to be really scoped down projects. They have to be experiments. They have to be, because that's the only way that we're going to learn when this stuff does come down the pipe. This is what it can do, and this is why we want it, and this, yeah.
And share, disseminate in those experiments so that we can all learn as a sector.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm totally prepared to be challenged. Since I've been working at Microsoft 10 months, and there's two things that there's a lot of things you learn at Microsoft, but two things. every day, what is the impact that you're making? And impact does not equal dollars there. What is the impact you're making on the industry? Everything is assessed that. That's the filter of everything. But the other one is, and you may have heard this, growth mindset, which I must say I sort of struggled with at the beginning just because it made me cringe as a term, not the concept. But growth mindset is this idea of always being open to being challenged, always open, so, you don't have to agree with me. I think my view is, it's not that it's an all or nothing so much as it can't be all on this end, which is that creative end, and not on some of that foundational. Because I also am very concerned when I look at a whole digital transformation opportunity in museums of, we're living on a house of cards, as we saw earlier, but that was a term that, is also used elsewhere. We're living on a house of cards in terms of that foundation. When it comes to the data that we have, the integrity of that data, the scalability of our systems, and the other thing that I've learned since coming to Microsoft is just how big that gap is between museums and other industries. And why is that? It feels like this is, the sort of, at least from my perspective, it feels like this is actually a more important industry. This is all about social good. This is all about protecting memory and making sure that we learn from past mistakes and all of this kind of thing. And so I feel like we shouldn't be sort of second in terms of the technology that's available to us.
I feel like the real world has solved a lot of the problems that we are running into today 10, 20 years ago. Yeah. So why are we just not learning from those things and using those things? And I think we should be doing that sort of outsourcing. I would say also, what this field, I think, and I'm fairly new to this field, to be completely frank, but I do feel that this field for a while has been dominated by monolithic vendors who try to do everything. And now we're in 2019, what we're thinking, the rest of the world is living on ecosystems. They're finding the best of breed that do particular things and making sure that those things talk to each other. So when a vendor comes to my door now, first question is, what are your APIs? How do you get the data in and out of that thing? Am I locked into you forever? And if so, I'm kicking you to the curb because that's not sustainable. That's a huge risk.
Yep, Carolyn?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything that you've just said. And, really what we're trying to do at Cooper Hewitt is really develop a roadmap that is an ecosystem and where we can see how the pieces of the puzzle fit together. And to also, I think, and this is very important for us, is to be able to do all of this at a pace and a scale that we can manage as well. Yeah. We're knowing what our capabilities are, knowing what our capacity is, and trying to manage the expectations with our management team around, and the rest of the museum, around what we can actually do. So the roadmap is, 5 years. We might change it, we might evolve it, but it's not something that's going to happen in the next 6 months.
Yep.
I just want to say how starstruck I am at the moment, being surrounded by the two of you. Amazing, thank you.
Yep.
Sorry.
Sorry, what did you say?
I'm starstruck by the two of you, so thank you for having me. Thank you.
That's hilarious.
I'm now very, very embarrassed.
No, I really admire, I think that, the people in this room, and especially as I scan the room and I see people that have been doing this for a long while, and these sorts of frameworks, roadmaps, they exist. We've been talking about this for a long while. I do think your point about sharing them out and being open and comparing them against each other, because I'll be honest, I think what might work for your museum might not work for a museum of my size. Absolutely. Or the single person museum that's out here. So figuring out how those things fit together and how that ecosystem can be the ecosystem of ecosystems, what the commonalities are among those that, then you find that one vendor that can serve, that particular function.
Yeah. Do you think that there is a challenge in the return on investment conversation in these organizations? Do we tend sometimes to look at the technology and not whether it's going to return what we're going to spend on it?
It's an ongoing battle.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I worked in a war museum, so I think about everything as hand-to-hand combat. But but it's because it's often not tangible. It's unseen. It's very difficult to argue. And when you go back every year and say, well, I don't just need the same thing you gave me last year. I need more because we want to do this and this, and you get this kind of blank face back at you, or just no. It's advocating. So again, you have to be strategic. You have to demonstrate why it's important. You have to find along the way some quick wins as well. You can't constantly be in a state of it's coming, and nothing appears. But and often you have to advocate up, and you also have to advocate down. It is the challenge of being a museum technologist.
Yeah.
You know, and if you're lucky, you have someone at the top table that can help you, but invariably you don't. And so, you know, it's very difficult.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just thinking about sort of my museum and kind of the priorities of what the leadership, generally our board, generally where they sort of place their values around technology. And often, unfortunately, it is the flashy stuff, right? Because, you know, we're doing fundraising, and I think that's okay. Like, I actually think that as long as we own that that's what we're doing, then you can optimize for those particular goals in a different way. So if we need to make a flashy VR experience, then we'll do that if that's going to, you know, turn into the ROI of getting a funder interested in us for a bigger thing. Like those are the kinds of like conversations we're having, at least right now.
Yeah, and the challenge also is, you know, not to be, you know, just because there is a pot of money, not to be diverted from, you know, still sticking to your roadmap and sticking to the things that are important. So trying to find, you know, balance that tension, I think, between, as you say, you know, being able to demonstrate some of the great things that are out there, but also continuing to invest in what's important.
Yeah. If I was to say to the room, we did some research. I'm not saying it's scientific, right? But we did some research. We took the top 25 museums in the world by visitation. That's an arbitrary measure. And we looked at the apps that they had that still were around. Some of you have heard this from me before. And we calculated two things. One, what is the commonality of features? And the other one was how much money was totally tied up in that. And so we found two things. 80% of the features are the same. They don't look the same. The presentation layer is not the same. But at the features, 80% of the features are identical. We all do very similar things. $25 to $50 million was the total sum of grants to fund those apps. And most of them are now, as we know, there's an ongoing conversation about the role of apps in museums and their sustainability. But I think when we think about some of these, and the reason I say that is apps is not an emerging technology today. It was. 5 years ago when we were all building them, it was. You can now build an app probably overnight with very little money, and the only money that you actually probably need is all around design agency work, right? Because obviously we want that great experience and look. My point is, there is a cost to getting into technology too early. I'm not suggesting that we don't do it at all. I'm just saying that we go in thoughtfully and understand what that is. And I think that, you know, when you look at it across an industry, you wonder two things. Is there an opportunity for collaboration? And is that the best use of that $50 million? So if you, just to finish up, and then we'll take to questions from the room. If you were to place your bets on the best of all the emerging technologies, mixed reality, AI, virtual reality, et cetera, where would you place your bets now as the best to be experimenting with? Sorry to put you on the spot.
All of them.
Yes.
All of them? Okay.
Yeah, all of them. And,
But
and also still people.
Of course, yes.
If I had
Human
to
people.
like pick something, I would say like natural language processing, AI kinds of things. I think there's a lot of text that we've got in our collections that we can manage and deal with differently, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and I mean, as well for us, I think just as a design museum, really trying to use this technology to surface some of the hidden design stories and and help augment understanding.
Yeah, my opinion, for what it's worth, is it's about using artificial intelligence to actually knowledge mine. So knowledge mine our collections, knowledge mine our data around customers. I feel like that's a relatively mature and scalable kind of model, relatively speaking, not relative to some other technologies. But I think, you know, that's my 2 cents worth, but I'm sure we all have different opinions. So with that, let's wrap up and just, you know, take some 5 minutes of questions from the room. Interested in people's opinions. Feel free to challenge me, growth mindset. I hear that like 10 times a day.
Hi, Is this on?
Yep.
Hi, thank you. Great discussion. My name is Mark. I'm from the Low Art Museum at the University of Miami. Thinking about technology, and we've been talking a lot about AR here in other sessions. I think a lot about the translation technologies that are existing now, which in some way or another are service as a form of AR. And so working in museums, thinking about access, accessibility, inclusion, I've been really curious about leveraging these technologies to enhance our ability for live guided tours, general text throughout the galleries, et cetera. I'm just wondering if any of you have seen or experienced the use of these technologies being leveraged in that way. I feel surprised that they're not being, this is not a criticism, but to what I'm aware of, that Microsoft isn't working directly with a particular museum or library in this capacity, and it just seems like there's a gap there.
Yeah.
And an exciting place to fill.
Well, all the big tech companies have translation technology, but I'm going to talk about mine. But I'm not suggesting that we're the only one. So Microsoft has some great translation technology. I think it raises a really interesting point. There is a view that unless it is perfect, we should not do it. And I think there is lots of because it's not human, it's not going to be perfect. Actually, we would even challenge that if you had communications between two humans, would you actually necessarily translate perfectly, even English to English, right? About what the person said or whether you understood it. And so I think this idea of it has to be perfect, because the cost of getting it perfect, doing it manually, is significant, both in terms of time and dollars, versus the cost of something that is 90% correct, or 95%. I'm not saying actual numbers, but it's in that kind of range, and depending on the language. And so I think we often, it's like, we can't present a less than perfect experience, but there's a trade-off there between accessibility for our visitors versus perfect. And I don't know the answer to that question, and I think it would be a great discussion at some point in a conference, but I think the technology is there today, and very accessible and free. So it's not like, there's a cost attached to it.
Yes, and I would also say that you could probably go right now and do a Google search for translation technologies and find a tutorial. Bing, sorry, yes. Whatever your preferred. So
I use Google, by the way.
That's fair. And by the way, thank you for calling that out. That's probably, that's the counter argument for why AR is really appropriate right now. These kinds of, when they bring you new affordances to experiences in the galleries, that's of course a really good reason. I mean, I'm still not sure that AR itself, because you're holding on to this thing, is really the right accessible thing. But still, I mean, I think experimenting in that space is really great.
Great. Any other questions? Yep, Matt, of course. I thought I got rid of you a year ago.
Matt Tarr, Museum of Natural History, and MCN Board of Directors, as is the gentleman who just asked. And president, yes. Not just a member. I am the president of the Hair Club for men. So, anyways, my question is, or maybe it's sort of a provocative statement about where we should be experimenting. And I think, as you know, Catherine, we have really been talking about the entirety of the visitor journey. And so I find myself thinking most often, honestly, right now about this notion of voice of customer and collecting the visitor's experience data, and how do we do that? You know what I mean? So I think to your point is like, I want it to be invisible. We used to talk for years about no more screens, but I get the NPS, I get about 60 or 70 of them a day of just like visitors literally telling us the problems, you know what I mean? And there is no replacement for that. And so I want to feed that into some AI and have it be, charted and graphed and be useful in making these statements to leadership who, I mean, once you start to see this stuff, you can't unsee it, you know what I mean? So I think that is a piece. It's not emerging at all. It's just this stuff that 20 years ago, right?
Absolutely.
Wendy's started putting a survey thing on the bottom of their thing, and we can't figure out how to do the same. So I think there's plenty for us to do in that regard. So I don't know if there's anything emerging.
Well, I agree, and I think it's part of this, idea of where do we, and I realize that we have funders, and I realize that drives a certain type of, investment. But as when we look holistically, it's where should we be spending our time? And it may not necessarily be, at least my opinion, it may not necessarily be in all of those emerging technologies, and particularly early on when they're immature and very, very expensive. Like I think I'm not suggesting anyone in this room is doing it, but I think I became aware of this amazing VR experience that everyone's talking about, but the price tag was 12 million. I was like, how can we, I'm not suggesting we don't do that, but also how can you justify that? That's my opinion. Okay, any more questions? I think we're over time. Actually, I think we're right on 30 minutes. And I'm sure you all want lunch. Anyone else before we? Thank you very much.